Yes.
Ready?
Yep, already started.
All right. Hello. So, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Rob. I'm the secretary of the Muslim Student Association, the MSA. For those who thought I said something about salami, you must be hungry, because Assalamu alaikum is a common Arabic greeting, meaning peace be upon you. Before I get to our guest speaker, I just want to introduce the MSA board. We have Lazina here, who is the president. We have Casey here, who is the treasurer. Now on to our very special guest, which we are very much welcome here at NSA for anyone. Our special guest serves as the executive committee of the CARE Philadelphia. In this role, he helps advise staff and shape the vision of the organization. He also delivers workshops within the Muslim American community. He has also founded Saber Prep, a community service organization helping to improve educational outcomes for underserved communities in the Upper Darby area of Pennsylvania. In the fourth year of this program, students are introduced to career options and are provided with guidance for the college application process. After a long history of many job positions, he currently works as a consultant to an investment management industry. And say for anyone, please give a warm welcome to Ashik Fazlova.
All right, everybody can hear me all right? Good. So thanks for inviting us. Inviting CARE Philadelphia. CARE is the Council of American Islamic Relations. It's America's largest and most active civil rights organization. It's focused on the Muslim American community. You can sort of think about it as the ACLU for the Muslim American community. I guess I've been invited here to talk about Islam and how it relates with other faith communities. So we'll kind of do a quick overview, maybe spend 10 minutes about the faith, and then we'll spend some time looking at pieces of scripture and discussing it or analyzing it and seeing how it relates to other faith communities. So as Hyder mentioned, I work in the financial services industry, but I'm also a Penn State grad. I went to Penn State Erie for my first 2 years and finished up at University Park many, many years ago, a couple decades ago. So it's always fun. I was looking forward to coming to a Penn State event, so thanks for having me. Okay, so the other thing I'll say as we start up, if we have a relatively intimate group here, we got about 20 folks at this point. If people want to move down and be closer, feel free to. It'll help make it a tighter group and make it easier to converse. So I'll leave that up to you guys if you feel comfortable. Okay, so what I'd like to start out with is, these types of discussions about Islam, people often come with preconceptions of what Islam is or who Muslims are. So I wanted to throw it out there. So I like to start with this. Name some Muslims that you know, other than, let's say, your friends. Since around here you may know some friends. Or let's say some famous Muslims, prominent Muslims, maybe notorious Muslim people. Anybody come to mind? And don't be bashful or say, I don't want to say that name. Malcolm X. Okay, good. Anything else? Muhammad Ali. Good. Anybody more recent? Say, the kid with the clock. From Texas, he would be one too, exactly. So a lot of times when we do ask these questions, we'll get the more headline people in the news. And so what I like to do is then show this. So these are, anybody recognize any or all of these Muslims? Malala Yousafzai, okay. Anybody else? Dr. Yunus over here on the upper right-hand corner. Anybody else? No. Even the Muslims don't know. So here we go. So 6 of the last 12 Nobel Peace Prize winners are Muslims. So it's a fact that probably many of us are not aware of. And so I've just quickly kind of written down who they are, what country they came from, and the year they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And these are all kinds of reasons. The latest one, the Tunisian delegation, it was basically a political reconciliation across the country after some upheaval. Mohammed al-Baradei, he was head of the International Nuclear Agency Commission. Dr. Yunus, he founded a new way to provide credit to people who weren't available to get credit before. So there's all kinds of folks that are involved, different countries. And I also like to show this picture because the 3 women, there are 3 women, and they themselves have chosen different styles of dress for themselves. So there's not like a style of dress or an interpretation of faith. All these women have chosen a little bit different way to go about that. Okay. And then as far as Muslim Americans, bringing it home a little bit closer, there's 2 Muslims in Congress currently. So we're not doing as well as in Canada. Canada just had re-elections. 10 out of their 340 members of parliament are Muslims there. So Mohammed al-Arian, he's one of the, he was the CEO of one of the biggest bond funds in the country. I work in finance, I know about that. Anybody who's used YouTube or streaming on YouTube, it was co-founded by Muslim American. I think many of us have probably used Khan Academy to supplement our math. That was Sal Khan. For those of you who are Daily Show fans, there are 2 correspondents on the Daily Show that were Muslim, Asif Manvi and Hassan Minhaj. Anybody from Chicago or visited the Chicago area? Those 2 huge prominent buildings when you visit Chicago. The Sears Tower, now called the Willis Tower, and the John Hancock Center. They're iconic structures built in the 60s. The structural engineer and design engineer on that project was a guy named Fazlur Rahman. So 2 of America's most iconic, tallest structures were built by, or designed by Muslim Americans. And then we mentioned Muhammad Ali. I also put up Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and for those of you who are into poli-sci, Fareed Zakaria from India. Okay, so we'll do a quick Islam 101. So Islam literally means voluntary submission of one's will to God. And that's the simple definition of what it is. We'll talk about big I Islam and little I Islam. And what we'll mean by that is big I Islam will sort of denote what we think of as Islam. The traditions, the prayer habits, all the images that you think of. And small I Islam I will use to denote sort of the concept of Islam. And Muslims feel and believe that this concept of submission to the will of God is a universal thing, and it's kind of transcendent over time. So by that definition, prophets like Abraham, like Moses, like Adam, these were all Muslims because they submitted their will to submitted themselves to the will of God. So the word Allah has some strange connotations in the current American modern context sometimes, and so we'll define that. So Allah is just the Arabic word for God, the supreme creator, sustainer of all things. And many Christian Arabs use the same word. So I saw an article I'd say now it's a couple months ago, the patriarch in Palestine, the Christian patriarch, who's an Arab, who's Palestinian, he says Allahu Akbar. He says God is great. And he says, because in my language, as an Arab, that's how I pray. So it's not an alien concept. It's just, if you went to, Brazil, they would use the word God. They would use the Portuguese word for God. If you went to China, it would be the different word for God. So Allah is the Arabic word for God. And the thing that's emphasized over and over again, as you read the Quran, as you study Islam is this reoccurring theme of reminding people in the unity and the oneness of God. This is the kind of paramount theme that comes over and over again. And so that's the basics of it. So it's the belief in something larger than yourself, belief in a creator. Number two, it's understanding that there's an accounting for our behavior. And number three is if you take those two things as faith, then it should affect how we behave. So we should then follow the golden rule, essentially. You should be wanting to do to others as you would want them to do to yourself. And so these things are universal across the great monotheistic traditions, but they're universal across all traditions, from Native American traditions to Hinduism to everywhere. I mean, these concepts of knowing and believing in something greater than ourselves, knowing that our actions have consequences, and therefore we should behave honorably toward one another. So now we'll talk a little bit about capital I Islam. So the concepts we talked about now get formulated in a set of practices. And so the first practice piece is just to believe. So to state that you believe that there is a single creator and sustainer of the world. And then the second part is to worship and pray. And we would, for Muslims, it's praying 5 times a day. So there's a morning prayer that happens between dawn and sunrise. Right now it's between 6 and 7. There's an early afternoon prayer starting around 1. There's a late afternoon prayer starting around 4. There's a prayer between sunset and dusk. So that is right now around 6 to 6:30ish. And then there's an evening prayer. And there's many more optional prayers, but those are the ones required of observant Muslims. Next one is zakat. Zakat is, in Christianity, it would be called tithing. So giving a portion out of your wealth to those who need it more than you do. In Christianity, it's often called 10% of your income. In Islam, the way it was defined is 2.5% of your wealth. So it's just a different way to come up with the tax. But the concept and the amount comes across very similar. The fourth one is fasting. I think many of you have seen, or you've seen your friends fast during Ramadan, but Muslims also fast through several other days of the year. Most recently, this past Saturday, in the Islamic calendar was the 10th of Muharram, and many Muslims, it's not required, but many Muslims feel strongly about fasting that day. That day has many commemorations. Muslims feel that was the day that Adam and Eve were sort of given salvation, so to speak, after they were cast away, that they were given the knowledge of how to repent. Jews and Muslims also believe that that was the day that Moses and his people were set free from Egypt. And there's also a commemoration of a tragedy within the Muslim community of fighting within the community that killed the grandson of the Prophet. So that tends to be a day of fasting. And then Hajj is the last one. So for those who are physically able, both mentally and physically and health-wise, and have the financial resources, are required to perform Hajj once in a lifetime. So that's go to Mecca and perform the rituals around Mecca and Medina. So again, remember, it's only required if you have the means and you have the physical ability. And we have to remember that most Muslims can't do this, either because of means, mostly because of financial means. So I think every year somewhere between 2 and 3 million Muslims go on Hajj. So if you take 3 million, in a century, how many Muslims would go on Hajj? Come on, math, a little bit of math. 3 million times 100, 300 million. And there's over like, 1.6 billion of Muslims currently in the world. So in a whole century, only 300 million get to go on Hajj. So we'll talk a little bit about the Quran. So the Quran was not written by Muhammad. That's not what Muslims believe. Muslims believe this is the revealed word of God, passed through the angel Gabriel, and recited by the Prophet Muhammad. And for Muslims, some of the proofs for the Muslim mind is that Muhammad was not a very well-educated person in his society. He was not known to be like a very fluent poet. He was known for his character. He was known as a trustworthy person. So it was, for Muslims, it's sort of a miracle that somebody who was not known to have education or poetic qualities, knowledge, was able to recite something like this. So it's proof for Muslims that this is something that came from God. The book was revealed over a decade about 2 decades, and was compiled into 114 chapters that are called surahs, and the surahs are broken down into verses. Verses are called ayahs. So that's the main scriptural text for Muslims. The second scriptural text for Muslims is the Sunnah, and that's the sayings, actions, and deeds of the Prophet. And those have been codified into something called books of hadith. The books of hadith have a little bit more give to them. People will discuss them, argue about them. Scholars will agree whether a certain hadith makes sense or not. But the Quran across the board for Muslims is sacrosanct. And it's really unchanged. I mean, academically, it's unchanged since it was compiled as a book in the mid-600s. So whether one chooses to believe in the scripture or not, its textual wording is unchanged since the mid-600s, since it was revealed. So that's something that Muslims feel very fortunate to have, that they have access to the original text, pronounced in the original dialect. That tradition has continued through time. So now this is going to require a little bit of audience participation. So I'm going to read the surah. This is the first surah of the Quran. It's called Surah Fatiha. This is an English translation of it. And what I want you to think about as we read it is what comes to mind. Because this is something that Muslims, observant Muslims, say 17 times a day. So it's repeated over and over again. So let's see what it sounds like. So in the name of God, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, praise belongs to God, Lord of the worlds, the Lord of mercy, the giver of mercy, master of the day of judgment. It is you we worship. It is you we ask for help. Guide us to the straight path, the path of those you have blessed, those who incur no anger and who have not gone astray. So, any thoughts? What does this sound like? Particularly from people from other faith traditions. Anything? We did this presentation at Baruch Hebrew Academy. Oh, go ahead. Similar to the Lord's Prayer, exactly. So we did this presentation at Baruch Hebrew Academy with 12th graders who had studied students of Torah and Talmud. And that was very similar. They were like, this sounds like a very universal type of prayer. It sounds like the Lord's Prayer. And it's very simple, it's very deep, and it's very universal. And this is what Muslims recite at least twice during each of those 5 prayers. Those 5 prayers have various lengths. So that's how I get to the 17 times a day. So in the morning one, they recite it twice. In the early afternoon one, Muslims recite it 4 times, etc. So it turned out to be 17 times. Any other thoughts or comments about the Fatiha, the first surah? Yeah. Okay. So, obviously we live in times that show a lot of conflict across societies and sometimes across civilizations. And there's a lot said about that certain faiths are incompatible with modernity or incompatible with peace. And so what I'm going to go through the next couple slides is really show that all faith traditions hold these values the same. What's the difference is how people choose to interpret them. So as soon as we read something, and we've done this in literature class, we'll read the same exact paragraph, and the teacher will say, or the professor will say, like, what do you think about it? We each interpret it differently. And that's what happens when we read scripture too. We each interpret it differently. And in the Quran, it's specifically mentioned that certain passages are very straightforward, and there's really no debate about them. There's also many passages that have nuances of meaning. And the Quran specifically says this, that other passages are open for debate. Not debate of whether they're right or wrong, but how to implement them, how to understand them, how to interpret them. And so you could think of this in other scriptural traditions as literal versus figurative or allegorical, things like that. So there's at least twice, it's in this exact, these are verbatim in chapter 2, verse 62, and chapter 5, verse 69. But this concept is written very similarly over at least a dozen times. Like when we read the Quran, we run into this every 10 or 15 pages or so. And what it says, I'll read it. It says, to the believers, and when it says Muslims, it's saying one who submits their will to God. And the Jews and the Christians and the Sabians were a people in that area. Some people feel that these were followers of John the Baptist. So it says, for the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians, and all those who believe in God, the last day, and do good, will have their reward with their Lord. For there is no fear for them, nor will they grieve. So it's pretty straightforward in that way. Saying, as we talked about earlier, for those who believe in something greater than themselves, know that there's an accounting for their behavior, and act accordingly, that is the path of Islam, with a small I, and in this case, a big I too. And Muslim tradition is really a continuity of faith. Over and over again, previous prophets are cited, previous stories are cited. So, for example, there's a whole chapter on Mary, on Maryam. It details her trials, her ordeals, what she goes through as she is with Jesus, gives birth to Jesus, and how she deals with the community, bringing back a child when she's never been touched before. There's stories from the Old Testament. There's stories about the Ten Commandments, about, just like when we've seen the movie The Ten Commandments, there's stories. The second surah of the Quran is called the cow, Baqarah is the cow, and it talks in detail about the story about the golden calf that Moses goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the tablets, and while he's away, his people fall into idolatry. That story is detailed. So it says here, in this particular ayah, say to one and all, this is telling the prophet, we Muslims believe in God and what has been sent down to us, to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, the tribes of Israel. We believe in what has been given to Moses, Jesus, and the prophets from their Lord. We do not make a difference in faith between any of them. Thus, we are Muslims in willing submission to God alone. So Muslims revere all the prophets of the Old Testament and New Testament. And their tradition is just a continuation of what's going on. And then the message is the same. The message is, again, remember God and act accordingly. So at this point, we might be wondering, well, if it's all the same, then why do we have so many different religions, and then why do we fight, and why are people different? What's this all about? And so an answer or a guidance can be found in the Quran where it says, Indeed, we have created all of you from a single male and female. This is referencing Adam and Eve. Moreover, we have made you into peoples and tribes so that you may come to know one another. Indeed, the noblest of you is in the sight of God is the most God-conscious. So it's sort of like you could look at it as a challenge. I think it seems like people naturally cling to those that are like them, whether it's racial or ethnic or religious identity, or even income identity. But the challenge is to go beyond us. So to really understand ourselves, our faith, our community, we have to touch other people. We have to get to know other people. And once we do, we find out those commonalities. And so the way I interpret this is it's a challenge upon mankind, humankind, to go out and get to know one another. And once you do, you find out the differences are pretty minuscule. So I had given a similar talk last fall to a Jewish Boy Scout jamboree. And then I sat in it was on a Saturday, so I sat in on services. And the services, I had never been to Sabbath services before. And at the end of the service, I was talking to the rabbi, I was like, there's so much commonality that like I can feel like the prayers, the chanting, the talk, that these were very similar to what I've experienced in my life. So, but it was only by making an effort and going out and getting to know somebody else that I was able to experience that. If I stay within my own bubble, I don't get that. And so that's really, and there's a lot of places where the Quran asks us to go out to other communities and to remember that the best of people is not the people who practice a certain type of ritual. It's the ones who actually connect with God, the ones who truly in their hearts are doing their best, the most God-conscious. Right? And that's something that none of us can really know. We try, and only God knows from in our hearts where we are on that kind of spectrum of horizon. So I'll take a quick break. I've been up for about half an hour. And any questions, any comments, thoughts? We have a little bit more we can go over, but I want to open up. Yeah?
Is there a specific clothing you guys have to wear when you pray?
No, so there's not a specific clothing, but it's recommended and it's asked that when Muslims pray that they purify themselves, both physically and kind of emotionally and mentally. So Muslims will do a set of washings. They will wash their nose, wash their mouth, their face, their hands, their feet. And while they're doing this, they're sort of getting into the zone of wanting to get closer to God and pray. And then you would want to then be modestly clothed. So, I mean, basically, you don't want to wear shorts, you don't want to wear a t-shirt or something. I mean, as much as you can. These are sort of like there's a spectrum of interpretation, but to be modestly clothed when one prays. And so that's very similar to other faith traditions where people will wear like a yarmulke or a hat or a kufi or a hijab or whatever. It's a sign of respect and deference when one is praying to their Lord. So it's very similar. And as far as specifically what Muslims wear, it will vary as you travel through Muslim societies. So if you go to Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim majority country in terms of population, and you will find a type of dress there. If you go to Oman, an Arab country that's very small, you will find something different. If you go to Morocco, it'll be still different. If you go to here, even on campus here, you will see Muslims that choose to wear different types of clothing. So the type of clothing is not required, but the concept of purity and modesty is. Anything else?
I was curious, a couple slides back,
Yep.
in the passage it had said we a couple times in reference to
Yep.
reference to God. I think it was Right, that one right there.
Okay.
And I was just curious, I mean, you know, God being a singular being, what that meant.
Okay, good. That's a good catch. So this is the royal we, if you go into like linguistics. When the Queen of England announces something, they'll say like, we announce this, as in, it's sort of a majestic royal we in linguistics. So it does not denote polytheism, it doesn't interpret different incarnations. It's the we, meaning we as in God, I, but the we is emphasizing a certain power, a certain precedence, and it's shown through that language. Any other questions, thoughts of what we've...
I want to follow up on that because I'm just curious if it translates from Arabic.
Yes. From my knowledge, I'm not a student of Arabic, I'm not very strong, but from what I know of it, I ask people, yeah, it's different. So at some places, God will say I, and some places God will say we. And those are different words, and so when translators have chosen to translate it in English, they've kept that difference consistent.
Does your holy book consist of dietary laws?
It does have dietary laws in there. Some of them are pretty explicit, and some of them are more interpreted. So there's dietary laws, for example, on alcohol, for American State. And the progression of alcohol was sort of interesting. So initially, there's a passage that came through that basically said, you know, in alcohol, paraphrasing, in alcohol and gambling, there's some good, but the bad outweighs the good. So, you know, for nowadays when people say, well, red wine is good for you, and so it's acknowledged that there is some benefit, but the downside, the Quran is telling us, is bigger than the upside. So at that point in the community, alcohol was not banned. It was just basically frowned upon, discouraged. Later on, after some period of time, the Quran said, you know, be sober during your prayer. They say, don't be drunk when you're praying. And then finally, it came down that alcohol is forbidden for people who choose to follow the faith. And there's different ways to interpret this. So some Muslim scholars, and for those who study Islam, you'll see that scholarship has always had multiples of opinion. It's sort of like, you could make an analogy to like our American judicial tradition. You know, in the Ninth Circuit, a judge will rule one way, in the 10th Circuit, a judge will rule a different way on a similar topic, and then they'll have to go to a Supreme Court. But we don't have a Supreme Court in Islam, particularly in Sunni Islam. So these multiple opinions sort of have followings, and that's why there's not a unified theory in that way. But now I forget, I lose my thought. What was your question again? Dietary law, right?
Yeah.
Dietary law, okay. And so yeah, these types of dietary laws, and so one tradition says that each of these ayahs was superseded by the last. Sort of like the one that's more strict invalidates the one that was previous. But there are some scholars who are uncomfortable with that. They say that we don't like saying that parts of the Quran invalidate the other parts of the Quran. That doesn't sit right with them. And so what they say is that this is kind of a gradual process. Modern way, maybe we would call it a 12-step program. Knowing that if somebody comes into the faith and they have practices that are not aligned with it, you can't go, most people can't go cold turkey. So this is sort of a pathway to like gradually leaving practices that are outside the faith.
I've noticed in like many religions, what leads to that? I understand like, I guess you can interpret one line or another. I guess that's why it leads to so many different interpretations.
So interpretations it comes from scripture, but it also comes from time and place. So I'll give an example. So there's, largely there's 5 major schools of interpretation, I would call them, and they're called madhabs. And there's they're called the Maliki. These are named for the people who started them. So it's Maliki, Hanafi, Shafi, Hanbali, and Jafar. And these schools of thought sort of interpret the law. And you could sort of think of it, it's not a perfect analogy, but you can think of it as American law, Canadian law, English law, French law. These are all Western law, and they trace their roots back to Roman and Greek law, but they've kind of changed over time. They're a little bit different. Like I said, that's a sort of okay analogy. And so what happened was, for example, Maliki law started with Ibn Malik, who was in Medina. And if you look at where Medina was, that was the center of the Islamic civilization in the 700s. That was where the Prophet had been. That's where the descendants of the Prophet had been. They didn't have to deal a lot with interacting with people from other faiths. Within a few generations, everybody had converted, and it was a very Islamically monolithic society. So their questions were of a different sort. Abu Hanifa, at the similar time, in the 700s, he was living in what's now Iraq, which was the border between the Persian Empire, the Byzantines, the Arab world, the Muslim world. And so he's having to deal with questions of interaction with other faith communities. And so he's having to do a lot more interpretation. And so the Hanafi tradition had different types of interpretation than the Maliki tradition did. And so that was because of time and place, in addition to scripture. So there's many reasons why. And then ongoing wise, there's political reasons, right? So the caliph who was ruling Baghdad in 1200, maybe he would influence the judiciary, just like presidents try to influence our judiciary. So these things kind of change over time. So those are some of the reasons why interpretations are different or slightly nuanced over time and place, in addition to just interpretations of the scripture. Any other questions?
What causes the misconceptions of Islam today?
I think there's a couple different reasons. I think misconceptions come from a lack of interaction and knowledge. So whatever you're learning today and hearing about today, a lot of people don't have that chance, right? So if you're the average person, between like work and school and commuting and groceries and taking care of your family and everything, you don't have time to learn about a different faith tradition. So all you know is what you catch on the news, or you catch on the radio, or you hear on your Facebook feed. That's about it. And so if the narrative is negative, that's what you're going to consume. And so it's very understandable and natural if you don't have interaction with somebody that's other than yourself, that you're not going to know about other ways to interpret it. I think that, to me, that's the main thing. That's why I join CARE. That's why I like doing these talks. There's a chance to talk to people, interact, share, because that's the main thing. Now, secondarily, on both sides, on both the Islamophobic side and the extremist interpretations of Islam, they're both kind of, in a strange way, on the same page. They're choosing to interpret things in the most radical way, in the most way that's not congruent with the whole text. So I'll use an example. There's a verse that gets thrown around both by extremists and by Islamophobes in the Quran that says something to the effect that wherever you find people who don't believe, you go out and kill them. And so the Islamophobes use this as evidence that this is why Islam is dangerous, and extremists use this as their justification of what they're doing. But if anybody, when you choose to read the whole Quran, actually you don't even need to get through the whole thing. If you get through one chapter or half a chapter, you will see that the emphasis on preservation of life is like paramount. Muslims are allowed to suspend things like, for example, we're asked to refrain from pork and alcohol. You're supposed to fast during Ramadan. All of those things those are basic obligations, but those things are suspended when life is on the line. And similarly, when it comes to conflict or battle, there's extensive ayahs that go through that you can't kill civilians, you can't hurt women and children, you can't destroy crops, you can't poison the land. You can only engage with the person who is engaging with you. And as soon as they stop engaging, you have to stop engaging. So if somebody's fighting you, and then they're like, all right, I give up, you don't get to keep going. So these are well established, and people are taking one ayah, which is there, but the interpretation is if you read before and after, it tells you that you have to then follow the rules of combat. And so what somebody's choosing to do is say, I'm going to take paragraph 6 and ignore paragraph 5 and 7, which give the context around it.
In science, they define things that kind of like conclusions. Or you say it's I think we're finding a lot of information that
Yep.
just really starts to
Mm-hmm. So the question was about kind of faith and science, and Muslims throughout history have been very involved in science, all through the great period of the caliphs in the 1200s. There's a lot of Islamic science knowledge, and I personally don't see any conflict between faith and science. The things that we're finding out are so often from our point of view sort of confirmations of these things. So I'll give a couple examples. So there's a part in the Quran that describes embryology in relative detail, and this was in 630 AD in a society that was not educated, where science was not paramount, where writing was weak. It was a very oral tradition based. And in that world, descriptions of embryology about how a fetus takes shape, how it's grown, are given in remarkable detail. Now, I think for non-Muslims, it could be interesting. For people of the Muslim faith, these are sort of proofs to them. They see these things and they find it remarkable. And there's many things about, knowledge keeps coming out over time that sort of justifies it. So I haven't found any contradictions for me. I do see some conservative Muslims, just like there's conservative Christians and other faith communities that have a hard time reconciling modernity and science with their faith. But I think there's a lot of people that don't have that. Anything else?
Random question, but does Islam promote polygamy?
It doesn't promote polygamy. It is allowed in very limited, narrow circumstances. And over time, so it's allowed basically in times of war when there's, like say, not enough men to go around, so to speak. So if you have a battle in a society, and I don't think this matters anymore, but back in the day, let's say there was a battle, significant portion of marriageable age men were killed off, then there was a provision for it, only in those circumstances. And then it specifically says, if you can treat your wives equally. And then it goes on to say that you probably can't do that. So now, men, patriarchy has chosen to kind of ignore the footnote and caveat part of it and saying, like, oh, it's allowed, let's run with that. But really, the whole piece of it gives a very specific circumstance, gives a lot of qualifications on taking that circumstance, and then further says it's pretty unlikely that you can pull this off. Right. So historically, there's been the reason was initially limited to this battle situation. And so historically, women were not going into battle in large numbers. There were women, Muslim women, who were in battle during the early Muslim period, but they weren't in large numbers. So that would be one reasoning. It was, again, to deal with this imbalance in society. Secondly, historically, it would have been difficult to assign lineage. So if there's a woman and there's multiple, nowadays obviously we have the ability to do that, but historically you didn't. So lineage and being able to trace lineage was important to that society, so that's why. So I would say those are the two reasonings that come to mind. But to me, what is most important is the caveats and reasonings for the first case and how limited they are and how inapplicable they are now, basically. I mean, they're totally inapplicable now.
So fasting,
The purpose is very similar. So the question is, what's the purpose of fasting? And so the purpose of fasting is identical to almost very similar. And it's basically to help remind you to get closer and remember God. At a very basic level, it reminds you to control your desires. Number two, it reminds you that there are people that are doing without. So it gives you a small taste of that. Even though when we fast, we know at the end of the day we're going to have a meal. Often it's a pretty nice meal. For most people who are fasting, not fasting, but are truly in need, they don't know when their next meal is coming. So there's these very temporal things, but the real source of this and the reasoning is to remember God. You're supposed to not just fast, you're supposed to behave well toward others. You're not allowed to break into fights and yell and swear and cuss. Basically, when you're fasting, you're trying to be the best that you can be. And then at the end of the day, it's like, if you can do that for one day, let's do it for another day. If you can do it for 2 days, let's do it for a week. And, you keep doing it to the best of one's ability. But it's a reminder to remember that there's something bigger than ourselves, there's an accounting, and behave accordingly. So this theme comes again and again. The Quran, over and over again, as you read it, you'll see parts of it that says, remember me, remind yourself, think about this. When you see the seasons change, think about it. Think about the power that it takes. Think about what's going on. Think about where you are in relation to that. When you look at the heavens and the stars, contemplate that. And so that's really the purpose of fasting, is to get your body and mind in a place where you can contemplate and think and reflect and sort of get out of your daily rat race. Any other questions? Any controversial questions? We've had a couple, but...
Since you guys believe in God, what do you think of Jesus?
Okay, good. So, like all the prophets we've mentioned, I don't think I did mention briefly Jesus. So Jesus is a prophet for Muslims. He was a virgin birth from Mary, and he sort of made an analogy to Adam, because Adam was kind of put on earth. Adam doesn't have a mother or a father in the regular context. So the Quran makes allegory to that. Jesus is seen as a prophet. He was known to speak as a child. He performed miracles. So there's a lot in common with Christianity in Jesus. The difference really comes at the end of his life. So Muslims feel that he was not crucified and did not die on the cross. That's where the difference comes. Obviously, it's a big difference. That's why there's Christianity and Islam. But what the Muslim theology states is that God ascended Jesus to heaven at that time. So it was, if you want to talk about it, maybe it's sort of like mistaken identity on the cross or something like that. But Jesus did, the Islamic point of view is he didn't die on the cross. He was ascended to heaven. And that he will return. So Muslims are awaiting a return of Jesus also.
So you can't, well, how come you can, like, celebrate any holidays like Christmas or Halloween, stuff like that?
How come?
You can't celebrate holidays?
So that goes down to interpretation. So, as far as things like Christmas go, I think there's some Muslim families, particularly immigrant families, who are very apprehensive about losing their traditions and their faith. And they see Christmas as something that's a little bit different. But as far as celebrating or remembering Jesus, that's something that's in common. And so what we see now recently is there's some mosque communities, some Muslim communities that make Christmas kind of like a faith day, a faith service day. Halloween, so what is Halloween is kind of hard to define. In the current context, it's just like candy and costumes. But historically, it's basically All Saints Eve, right? So November 1st is All Saints Day, and the 31st is All Saints Eve. And it was a day of remembering those who have passed away in your lineage and in the saint tradition, right? But that's not sort of how it's remembered. And because of the sort of occultish themes that arise around Halloween, I think many Muslims, particularly older Muslims, feel uncomfortable with it. And so some of them will restrain their families from participating in that. But I would say for the most part, I dressed up as Casper. There's a picture of me as Casper when I was 5. So most families participate in the same way that most Americans do. It's a kind of costume and candy event. Any other questions or thoughts? Feel free to come up with anything. This is the fun part.
Does Halloween have something to do with hiding your identity? Because when I asked my brother, because he's Muslim,
Yeah.
and he has kids, so I asked him, was he taking them trick or treating? And he said no, because it's hiding your identity. And it's kind of like a Muslim culture thing, but I didn't know. It was like, it's all new to me, everything he's explaining.
Yeah, I've heard that some people. These are points of interpretation. Like I said, I know plenty of families that will participate. I know other families that are not too keen on it, but it's not a big deal. And then I know some families that are like, no way. And I also know some very observant Christian families that feel similarly. Like I have some evangelical friends that are like, we don't do Halloween. And it's a similar concept, their degree of comfort or uncomfort with the holiday.
So, in the Bible, like you said, the world was created in 6 days. Isn't the same concept in
So as far as the number of days, I should know this, I don't know, but yeah, God created the earth, the heavens, these types of things. What was the period of time? We don't know. But the period of time is sort of, I don't want to say not important, but it's all allegorical. What is 6 days, at least in the Muslim tradition, that time period may or may not be congruent with our concept of time. These things that happened before human beings were created, when the heavens were created and the earth and the punishment areas and all these types of things were created, what time period this happened over is not, as far as my knowledge, not detailed in the Quran. It's talked about. And then scholars have debated about some of these things, but the exact how the length of time doesn't impact theology. Yeah.
It's not controversial, but it's not the existence of God.
Okay.
Because you go, you say there's God, the creator is God, the creator is God. It's not the correct thing. So keep going. But is there like an answer or something in the Quran that says where God
where does, so you're saying, okay, I believe in the creation and everything, but like, what happened before creation, right?
Because you can't say anything.
It's probably beyond my scholarly capability. I know there are scholars that talk about these things and debate it. It's not my area of knowledge that I've studied very much, so I'm a little bit careful to go there. I'll give a little bit of theology around what Muslims believe as far as going back in time. So the Muslims believe the Quran is sort of like everlasting. It was around before. It was given to Muhammad in the 600s, but it's sort of preserved in this allegorical tablet with God. And over time, Muslim theologians have argued about which came first, the word or the beat. And so there were some arguments over that. But that's as far as I've gotten. I've sat in occasionally on arguments or conversations about this, and I sort of tune out because I know there's no end. So I'm like, we're not going to get to a solution. So it hasn't interested me, so I'm not as knowledgeable of where to go.
I hope that I'm not too mistaken on this in this question, but in the same way that, in the same way that Jesus was Jewish, right before obviously his followers became known as Christians,
Yep.
and that same way was the Prophet Muhammad and his, I guess, religious following. Were they Jewish prior to his visions of the Quran?
So that's a good question. They were not. There were Jews in that part of Arabia at that time, but his kin, his family line was not Jewish. They were just local pagan Arabs, so to speak. He himself is known to have not subscribed to that. So he grew up in a sort of pagan society, but he, and there's other people that of note, were just sort of, they were called just general monotheists. They weren't Christian, they weren't Jewish, they weren't Sabian, but they didn't buy into the paganism either. And so Muhammad and some other people were believed to be among those sort of independent monotheists. And then he was basically a reformer. Like all prophets, they're reformers. They're put into a place of trial, of challenge, where society has a lot of ills. And so this was the ills of oppression, of the weak being oppressed by the strong and the wealthy. There was a tremendous amount of racism, about slavery, about misogyny. And so in that context is when Islam was, or the Quran was sent to the Prophet and he started preaching from that. So he was not from that tradition, so to speak.
So then when the Quran was sent to him, I mean, like you said, there's so much similarity between that and the Torah and the Old Testament, but he had actually, it was sent to him independent of him, like looking at those and saying, this is how it happened instead.
Yeah, and so Muslims see that as a proof, so to speak. Now, it's not going to be a proof for maybe the average person, but from the Muslim point of view, they see here's a person that didn't have a huge amount of detailed knowledge about these other traditions. They're in a relatively isolated part of the world, right? So the Byzantines and the Persians are going at it, but down in Arabia, they're sort of like cut off from everything. And here is a person that has knowledge of these stories, the details of these stories. And so there's some hadith that basically go on to say that they ask the Meccans, who are the powers that be, or the pagan powers that be, who are kind of fighting against him, trying to suppress his word. And he's asked, so the Jewish tribes in the area say, well, ask him about these things, see if he knows about it. And he did. And so from the Muslim point of view, those things are sort of proofs of his status as a prophet. That somebody who was not educated, not knowledgeable, came to know of these things. And so the only way that could have happened from the Muslim point of view is through his knowledge of what he was given by the angel Gabriel.
I don't need a mic. Okay, so let's say Muslims are allowed to date with the people in the book, right?
Sort of.
Christians and all that stuff. So let's say a Christian and a Muslim were dating, or a Catholic.
Yeah.
So how would that ceremony go?
Okay. So I said sort of because so dating itself is probably sort of frowned upon.
Yeah, I know.
As in most traditional societies. But let's say like an interfaith marriage. So I can tell you about one. My sister's in one. My sister married a Norwegian American evangelical. And so how it goes is, as far as the wedding goes, is, I mean, you try to find people. Most priests and most imams are not comfortable doing that at this time, you know. But we did find one who did, and so we had like an interfaith ceremony. And you know, as far as how they choose to integrate their faith, that's going to be their interpretation. So the community I grew up in of Muslims in basically the Chester County, Delaware County area over the last 20, 30 years, the friends I grew up with, like I'd say half of them have married with interfaith, intercultural marriages. And so each family has a unique way of how to interpret that, how to acknowledge that.
So is that like a sin if you like marry a non-Muslim?
No, so it's allowed to marry other faith traditions. Specifically, the people of the book, the Christians and Jews, are specifically mentioned. And then some scholars, I would say it's a minority of scholars, kind of broaden that out to people who truly believe. That's the real thing. It's not so much the label. It's like, do you believe that there's a God? Do you believe that there's an accounting for your deeds? Then you're that small I Muslim. You're a person who submits to the will of God. And what your rituals are not unimportant, but they're sort of secondary to this what's in your heart type of thing.
Thank you.
We're wrapping up? Okay.
One more question.
Sure.
Can we go over Islam and something called his Islam, like different interpretations of Islam, why people interpret it differently, and why they don't follow it the way it should be?
Okay. So interpretations, like in any faith tradition, are going to be based on the person interpreting it, their knowledge level, and there could be social and political circumstances that go around it too. So that's always going to take place, and we can see that in the Christian tradition, right? So Christianity is pretty broad just within the United States, right? So you have Catholics, you have evangelicals, you have other Protestant denominations. You have Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists. Recently those two traditions have had some controversy of how they align with the broader tradition of Christianity. But the Westboro Baptist Church, anybody know about them? Westboro Baptist Church? They're a pretty militant, not very loving church. They protest at military funerals and things like that. They're very virulent about their views and things like that. Technically, they're Christian. The Klan believes that they come from a Christian background. So the interpretations are many, right? And so just like that, in the Muslim tradition, there are many interpretations. And there are interpretations that the vast majority of us say don't make sense and are beyond the bounds of what is acceptable. But there's no authority that can kind of say you're beyond the bounds and you're gone. So particularly in Sunni Islam, there's sort of diffused authority. And so it's sort of like in Protestantism. There's not a person that can tell you, I mean, if you want to start your own denomination, you can, right? You can start a Bible study and have an interpretation, and you're your own denomination, so to speak. In the Catholic tradition, it's a little bit more structured. And so similarly, not exactly the same, in the Shia tradition, it's a little bit more structured the hierarchy. And and that's the challenge of faith traditions of all time. There are people who choose to interpret it in a poor way, at the very least, and sometimes they get traction. And not traction because their ideas make sense, but because of temporal issues. So I'll give an example. So Saudi Arabia is the poster child for Islam because that's where the Kaaba is, even though I would argue most Muslims don't regard that as the way that they would interpret it. So why did Saudi Arabia come to be? So the interpretation that is prevalent there, this Wahhabism, was founded by this guy in the 1700s. His own family, his brother and his dad were scholars, and they thought he was off his rocker. And kind of said, you're beyond the pale. And they thought, like, he's so crazy, this stuff is going to die off with him. But it didn't. It kind of lingered around with one tribe, and eventually, 200 years later, a particular tribe took control of the entire area of Arabia and implemented this version of it in their tribe, in their country. And then in 1932, they found oil. And now they had money to propagate their message. So there's interpretations that somebody came up with it, but they would have died off. But circumstances happened that it lingered around in small amounts, and then they were able to fund themselves, and now they've been able to spread their version of things. It'll die out eventually, but that's something that Muslims have to contend with. So it's a very challenging thing, but it comes down to this concept, the challenge of authority. There isn't a authority. So I don't believe it, but I don't really have any power over that. You disagree with it, you don't have power over that. So what can you do? It's a very challenging thing, and the best thing that my response to that is to practice the way I think is best, talk about it, converse, get to know other people like the Quran advises me to, and hopefully that these guys will die off eventually. Any other questions? That's it? Okay, well, thanks for having me. If you guys want to do more things or more in-depth things, we've done these 10-part programs where we'll sit in a classroom and we'll really have discussions. So if you guys are interested in that, let your MSA leaders here know, and we can implement something that's more long-term. Other than that, thanks for coming out. I mean, I came here when I was 3 months old. For all practical purposes. Oh, we did. Thanks so much.